of American parents. This is about an hour.
Hi. Thank you so much. It's an unbelievable honor to be here as a speaker in general, a lecturer, which is just beyond me, but also to be here as the Edward Said speaker. My father meant a lot to me, obviously, as most parents do, but he was very important to me as a father, as well as who he was to everyone else. So thank you very, very much for inviting me here. I have just published this book called Looking for Palestine. The subtitle is also very important because it's called Growing Up Confused in an Arab American Family. And that is the main thing that propelled me to write this book, was my own confusion and fear and apprehension about this, being the daughter of this famous Palestinian and not really feeling like I had any idea what that meant or who I was. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about what's in the book, just to give you background on that. And then I'm going to read to you from it, because I feel like that's easier than explaining what I've already written. And just to give you an idea of how my own identity as a Palestinian American has been, how I've formed it on my own in the past few years, which has been very difficult. So my mother's from Lebanon, and my mom is from a Christian family, but they're actually Quaker. So there's the first problem. And then my dad was, as many of you know, Palestinian, but born with American citizenship, went to British schools, and he wrote a lot about his own identity issues. And he left Palestine at a very young age. He was raised in Jerusalem, then Cairo, and then he came here to the United States at the age of 14 or 15. And he was also Christian, Anglican, Episcopalian to be precise. And I was born and baptized as an Episcopalian. So there, again, is another strange thing. So then I was raised in New York City, and I was sent to a private school for girls on the Upper East Side because my parents, of course, wanted me to get a wonderful, good education, and it was a very good school. However, everyone I went to school with seemed to be blonde and waspy. But I was Episcopalian, so you see, I sort of fit in, but I didn't. And then my father, meanwhile, was in the other room writing Orientalism about representations of Arabs in the media and art and literature. And I was, as I say in the book, watching I Dream of Jeannie and trying to figure out why I didn't have blonde hair, magic powers, and a sexy outfit. So there was a lot of. This is sort of how I see myself to this day, as this kind of confused, lost child of immigrants. And yet, I'm also the daughter of this person who, to many people, really stands, like really symbolizes Palestinian identity or Palestinian American identity. So when I became a professional actress, and I'm not going to get too much into this, but it became interesting to me to realize how much it mattered that my name was Najla Said, and I didn't want to change it. I didn't want to change it because, I don't know, it just seemed, as I said last night in a book talk, I honestly thought maybe if someone said a different name, I wouldn't answer them because I would forget that I changed my name or something. It wasn't like everyone thinks I did all these things with a certain amount of integrity and thought, but I honestly just didn't want to change my name. It seemed like a very old-fashioned, silly thing to do in the world in which we live. So, but when I became a professional actress and I realized what having this name, Najla Said, which regardless of who my father was, how it meant I would be perceived and what would be expected of me, I began to really start to deal with my identity. So in the book, I write a lot about how as a little girl, I went to school with these white Episcopalian girls, and I was Episcopalian and relatively white, so I was trying to fit in, but then I kept hearing that I was Arab, and then I would sort of look at TV and see what was being presented to me as what an Arab should be, which was Muslim and really brown skinned and a certain type of, all the things my father wrote about, either terrorists or, fanatic Muslims or just belly dancers. And so I didn't fit into any of these categories. So I was trying very hard to fit in to America and to be like my friends, but it wasn't working. And then when I was in high school, I switched to another school where the students were mostly Jewish. And all of a sudden, I fit in. And part of it was because of the way I look and the way I act, because I'm from the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which to many people is just a connotation of, it's just Jewish. It's this idea that New Yorkers from a certain part of New York who talk a certain way and have a certain type of neuroses are Jewish people. So I think what happened to me was I had a lot of confusion about my identity. And then as I got older, I started, in the time in which I was born in 1974, and my mom's Lebanese, as I said. So we would go to Lebanon, but the war started when I was about a year old. So there was a war in Lebanon, and then my dad was Palestinian, and I didn't quite understand how that fit in, because sometimes he couldn't come with us. And then my parents were Arab, but we weren't Muslim. So there was a lot going on in my brain. So I thought for a long time that the best thing to do was just avoid it and try to be American, which I think is something that a lot of young children of immigrants try to do. But then as I got older, I realized that I couldn't really avoid these things. And I would have to find a way to deal with my identity. When I was 18 years old in 1992, my father found out he had leukemia the year before, and so we went on a family trip to Palestine. It was the first time I went and the last time I went. I was 18 years old, and I think that when my father passed away in 2003, I wrote a journal entry about this trip because I had never really thought about it or made sense of it. But for some reason, I was missing my father, and I started writing this long journal entry, which ultimately evolved into a play called Palestine, which ultimately evolved into this book, Looking for Palestine. And what I think that this trip did for me was a few things. It forced me to confront all the different things about my identity that I wanted to avoid. It forced me to confront Palestine as a place and as an idea and figure out where I fit in that regard. It forced me to deal with my father's mortality, my own mortality, but also I just felt very afraid because I was 18 years old, and here was my dad telling me, I have just been diagnosed with leukemia. We're going to go back to Palestine. You're going to see it, and then you're sort of going to grow up and deal with it, and I'm going to go. So that was the launch point for the book, but in the play. And so I realized in the process of writing this book that although I always constantly feel like I still am this like confused, I don't know if I'm American, I don't know if I'm Palestinian, I don't know if I'm Lebanese, I don't know if I'm smart, I don't know if I understand politics, that I've somehow still managed to internalize and really take in and understand everything that my father stood for and spoke about and was famous for and was revered for, which is a certain amount of integrity and an association with my identity that it just is. It is part of who I am, and that is something that I will not deny, even if I don't feel like I have a house in Palestine, that I know each nook and cranny of the walls, or like my grandmother was there. I don't have any of those tangible connections, and I always thought that made me feel, that was what made me feel like I didn't belong there. But in writing this book and working through this process, I realized that I have actually taken in everything that my father taught me and taught all of us. And so, in a certain way, the most common question I've been asked, besides how does the daughter of Edward Said not know where she's from, which I think is not a fair question, but is, what would your father say were he alive now? What would he be? People constantly are writing, we wish Edward Said was here to comment. We wish he were here. We miss his voice. And what I've learned is he left us everything that we need. to analyze and look at things the way that he did. And my style of talking and writing and performing is very casual, very American, very, I come off as just a human being who's trying to figure it out. And I do that on purpose because it's important to me that I carry on something that he taught me, which is that as long as you're human and you present yourself as a human and with all your faults and your daily struggles and your wishes and your thoughts about what you like and what you would like to be and the freedom of movement you would like to have, to sort of relate it specifically to Palestinians, people will listen to you. So, many people talk about how he used to speak of this permission to narrate and tell your own story. And also this idea that we're all just human beings. And I think it's quite simple. And so, sadly, I went through this whole process of worrying about being the daughter of this person who seemed to represent so much and have these lofty ideas. But what has come out of it is this incredible realization that it's very, very simple. And we mustn't forget how simple it is. People have asked me, wasn't your father an anti-Semite? And I'm like, well, no, he was just Palestinian. And if you actually have read anything he wrote, you would see that he's in no way an anti-Semite. But people don't do that. People take their associations about your identity and just being Palestinian or saying I'm Palestinian carries this whole thing with it. And so the best thing that we can do and that I can do and that I've learned to do is just to present myself as a human being. And that's all there is to our moving forward in our quest for just peace and in terms of what's happening in the Middle East right now with all the upheaval and all the trauma and the sadness. I think my father would be very. I remember when in 2011 when Mubarak was finally ousted, I cried because I think that my father would have been so. It was everything he ever worked for was for this moment of people coming together and rising up and realizing that they have power to change things. But in the months that followed, people have been asking me, or the years that followed, people have been asking me, oh, what are we going to do? This is a necessary step. We're in a necessary place. The upheaval has to come. The difficulty has to come. Unfortunately, there's a lot of violence and death and horrible things. But my father would never encourage anyone to give up hope. And I think that that's the most important thing. And so my book was just written to remind those of us of the next generation, whether we're Palestinian or not, that we have all of the tools we need to continue this struggle and to move forward. I'm just going to read a couple of little sections from the book, and then I will answer any questions that you have. So in 1992, we went on this trip to Palestine. And at this point, I've just graduated from high school, and my father has been diagnosed with leukemia, and I am myself quite ill with an eating disorder, which had developed in part because of my own sort of disconnect with my culture and my identity. I just wanted to kind of disappear, and there was a lot going on. But so we went on this trip, and I didn't want to go. And we went to Palestine. We went to Jerusalem. We stayed in the American Colony Hotel, which at first really excited me because it was the American Colony Hotel. So I thought it would be American, and that would be good because I wasn't really excited about being in the Middle East. And then we went and we saw my father's home. And another thing which I pointed out last night was I was constantly, I was born in the States, and I lived on the west side of Manhattan, and all my friends lived on the east side. And then, so all I wanted to do was live on the east side. And then my mother was from Beirut, which was divided into east and west. And we lived in the west, but we were Christian, so we were supposed to be in the east. And my dad was from Jerusalem. He was from West Jerusalem. But we were Arabs, so we were supposed to be in the east. So that kept happening. I was supposed to be in the east all the time, and I was always in the west. So, and I only realized that recently. It's fascinating, like how much that played into these categories that these divisions that we create, and how so completely arbitrary they are, and how, like, I used to go to school in New York, and I would go to school on the East Side and be worried that if they would somehow, like, close off there would be a war and they'd close off the West Side and I wouldn't be allowed to go home. And so these are very real things that were very, very prevalent in my childhood, in my consciousness and my psyche. So this trip scared me a lot for a lot of reasons. So I'm just going to read. So we went to Jerusalem, and then we went and visited my father's, the house in which he was born and grew up, which is in, as I said, West Jerusalem. And we found out that, my father wrote about this for the Observer, the London Observer, that although we were frightened, my brother and I were convinced that we were going to see the name of one of our Jewish friends on the house, like, door. We fortunately didn't, but we did encounter a sign that said the International Christian Embassy, which was a right-wing Zionist Christian organ. So, again, we're Christian, I don't know. All of these things started to just spin around in my head, and I thought, I'm never going to make sense of any of this. Sorry, I just want to find. So this is on the trip, okay? It was on this trip that I learned that my parents both grew up in Arab cities with Jewish quarters that were as much a part of the city as any other neighborhood. In the Beirut of my mother's youth, there was not only a Sunni Muslim area, a Shiite area, and a Christian area, there was also a Jewish area. Even now, after more than one Israeli invasion and countless internal religious battles, the synagogue still stands in Beirut. And as in any other big city, each quarter earned its particular designation because of the families who settled there, and not because someone drew a line. My mom told me the story of how her famously philanthropic mother put money for the Jewish home in a blue box on the coffee table of a German Jewish neighbor in Beirut, without knowing that that home was going to be in Palestine. My dad talked of his Jewish friends in Egypt. My mom reminded me that her school, the one her mother ran, was in the Jewish quarter of Beirut. I wondered how their experiences were different from mine. I considered the Israeli kids in the park with their nannies. Their parents and their grandparents might have been victims of the European Holocaust, but those same adults had probably never thought anything about Arabs until they got to Israel. Yet here, now, not so much later, their children, me, these kids, none of us had ever known the other as anything but an enemy. It seemed so bizarre. I was suddenly struck by the reality of this conflict. It had not been going on for centuries. Its origins were recent, long ago, and at the same time not that long ago. Each group of children has the memories of our parents' separate tragedies to defend and protect, and none of us really get it. The divisions and separations began to suddenly multiply spasmodically in my head and then collide and violently come together. Palestinian, Israeli, Arab Christian, Arab Muslim, Arab Jew, Palestinian American, Jewish American. My father stopped in his tracks on the way back to the car to tell me what he really thought about the Middle East conflict. Naj, you know, it's my generation that's messed it up. We are too connected to the events of 48 and 67. We were there, we participated, and until we're all gone, my generation, the Sharons and Arafats and all of us, nothing's going to get done. It's up to your generation to fix it, really. He put his arm around me as we resumed our walk. I turned my head to stare back at the saucer-eyed Palestinian children whose blank expressions mirrored my own. I began to photograph them obsessively, wherever we went. I had no other way of capturing what I felt inside. On Tuesday, June 16, 1992, we piled into a UN vehicle and went to Gaza. My mom had told me I had to wear a skirt there, which I initially thought would be no big deal since I had brought many with me on the trip. As I got up from the breakfast room to change, my mother quickly and apologetically added that it could not be a very short skirt. I was taken back for a moment because my mother never seemed to care what we wore. But I heeded her warning and carefully chose a blue crepe Agnes B skirt that my parents had given me for my birthday. Long by my standards at the time, it hung just above my knees. I put on a pair of brown suede Oxford shoes from Fratelli Rossetti, an elegant store on Madison Avenue. I had no idea what was expected. I had no idea what to expect. I thought I looked modest enough, especially since my rail-thin body and baby face made me look much younger than my 18 years. But as soon as we entered the van, the driver suggested he stop for me and my mother to get us some sort of full-length abayas, cloaks, and hijabs, or headscarves, on the way. My mother refused, chiding the driver in Arabic. "We are not Muslim, but we are Arabs, and we can be respectful without being covered head to toe." He nodded his head and he let us be. I wanted to throw up. We entered the strip through a military checkpoint. There were army posts and intimidating soldiers manning stations all over the area, and more barbed wire than I have ever seen. Daddy commented to us, and later in his own article, that the entrance gave the place the appearance of an enormous concentration camp. We were searched, cleared, and let through. I took pictures from the car window as we approached Gaza's Jabalia refugee camp. There were people everywhere. "This place has the highest population density in the world," Daddy told us. 65,000 people live here, on top of each other. Naj, are you listening? In half a square mile of space. I was listening, but I didn't need to hear the details. I could see everything. The car windows were closed, but I could still smell the open sewers. Daddy continued to lecture us, all the while mentally taking notes for his article. The statistics are nightmarish. Terrible infant mortality rates, high unemployment, the lowest per capita income in the occupied territories, the most days of curfew, the fewest medical services, and on and on. And this was 20 years ago. Gaza today is much, much worse. Despite my mother's insistence that my outfit was fine, I felt very conspicuous and alienated from my people as I descended from the car. Then I put my fancy suede shoe down into the muddy earth of Gaza and inhaled that horrifying stench of raw sewage. It had penetrated the car window, but I had really only faintly smelled it when I was inside the vehicle. At that moment, I truly realized that I had absolutely no idea about anything. We had lunch at the house of some important people. As we entered, all of the men, including my brother and father, were guided into one room, the women into another. I was confused. I had been to the Middle East many times before, and despite my relative isolation in recent years, had nevertheless grown up around lots of Arabs, Muslim and Christian alike, yet this was a custom that I had never, ever encountered anywhere but in the movies. I followed my mom into the female salon. The women began talking about cooking. I understood them, of course, but my Arabic was too weak for me to respond. Frankly, though, I really had nothing to say. I didn't cook. I didn't even eat. My mother nodded, smiled, and politely answered all their questions. I could tell she was slightly bored, but was making every effort not to show it. I, too, was bored, so I slipped away into the room with the men. A saucy, defiant act it was, but I knew I would get away with it. I knew that to these people I was both just a little girl and an essentially American one. I could always pretend I didn't know any better. My father saw me in the doorway and waved his hand, gesturing for me to come in. Quite a few of the men jumped up to give me their chairs, but I smiled sweetly and quietly and perched myself on the arm of my father's, where I ultimately drifted off into a daydream. They were, much to my chagrin, but not to my surprise, talking about what men in the Middle East always seem to be talking about: politics. I felt like I had played the part of the bored teenager in this scene in just about every country in the Arab world, so I knew what to do. Tune out. Arab men always seem to want to sit and talk very seriously about politics. They would all listen intently to one another. Everyone would smoke a lot of cigarettes, drink cups of Arabic coffee, and some would finger prayer beads as they thoughtfully considered the argument to which they were giving audience. In this smoke-filled room in Gaza, all eyes were fixed on my dad. Most of the men did not even know why my father was important, other than that he was a connection to the outside world, or more specifically to the West. The irony of my dad's renown is that until he passed away, his face and name were far more familiar to people outside Palestine than they were to anyone who actually lived there. They did know he was important, though, and that they had been brought here to tell him their stories. After we left, I asked Daddy to explain to me exactly what had been said. I wouldn't have been able to follow the heavily accented Arabic conversation even if I had been listening. Later in his article, he used virtually the same words he had used with me. I didn't hear a single hopeful thing in the 2 hours I was with the men. One of them spoke of having spent 17 years in jail, his children sick, of relatives destitute. There was a lot of anger. The phrase I kept hearing was mot batik, slow death. There seemed to be considerable animus against West Bankers, who were variously characterized by Gazans as spoiled or privileged or insensitive. We are forgotten, they all said. And because of the unimaginably difficult job of dramatically or even slightly improving the general lot of Gazans, I was repeatedly enjoined, at least not to forget. I can try to conjure a picture of Gaza, but all I really remember of that day is a feeling. There was a dead goat, head and all, on a platter for lunch, and there was a small piece of fruit given to me by one of the young girls at the house, which I pretended to bite into and chew and swallow. She had plucked it off a tree near the porch for me, and then she chose a second piece for herself. She popped hers into her mouth and smiled. All that I noticed was the layer of filthy dust that covered the one she had given me. I didn't want to eat it because of the 8 calories, but I also wondered how anyone could actually eat a piece of fruit without washing it. The inside of the house was immaculate and beautifully decorated, even though the outside was stinky and dirty. I tried to wrap my teenage brain head around the existence of such a place in the world where people are trapped like caged animals in the filthiest zoo on earth, while I somehow got to prance around in suede shoes and $150 skirts and then get on a plane and go home. In this way, the trip to Palestine added another dimension to my anorexia. I wanted desperately to suffer, not just for my daddy, but for all of Palestine as well. I felt guilty, horrible, and sick to my stomach. I never wanted to eat again. How could I, when others who were just like me in every other way were unlucky enough to be born into nothing? So I'm going to stop there. But so that was the initial memory that triggered the writing of the play and the book. And when I started working on both of these things, I was writing from a point of view of everyone says I'm my father's daughter. Now my father's gone, and now I have to be my father's daughter. And I want to explain to you how little I know about where I'm from and who I am and what my father did. But in the process of creating this work and the play as well, I realized that I am my father's daughter. Everything in terms of the way I see the world and where I fit in it, everything I think about is colored by Palestine and being Palestinian, and trying to find a way to integrate that part of my identity. And you know, my father talked of having various different identities, and I have embraced all of my my confusion, my awkwardness, and my pain and difficulty at accepting being all of these different things. But at the same time, what's come through is that I'm still proud to be a Palestinian. So when I travel to schools, which I do a lot with this work, I realize that what we have, in part thanks to my dad's work, but also but also thanks to like the work of so many people who work on behalf of Palestinian rights, justice, solidarity, is we have, you know, I went to college 20 years ago, and you wouldn't be caught dead in a cafe unless you were actually Palestinian and wanted to start a fight or something. But now, I would say most of the kids on the college's campuses are well-informed, and they're aware. Even the Jewish kids talk to me about, I mean, I went to one high school in New York, and I think that they may have, after I left, started a program about talking about Jewish identity, because a lot of the kids were raised by grandparents and parents who were deeply affected by the Holocaust, but these kids didn't agree with Israel's policies. And so this one girl told me, my grandmother called me an anti-Semite, but I told her I'm a Jew, but I just don't like what Israel does, and what do I do? So there's a lot of that going on. And I think that I've realized in the process of writing and working through this and actually engaging with younger people is that whether it's just my father's work or all of our work or whatever it is, there is still a movement of for justice and equality for Palestinians. And so this fear that everyone expresses that we wish he were alive to tell us what to do or to tell us how to react is totally understandable, but it's also not necessary, because if I even turned out okay, everyone else will too. And I have great, great faith in the coming generations of young people, whatever their identity, as Americans and as immigrants to this country, in terms of fighting for equality and justice for Palestine. So that's really all I wanted to read and talk about. And I will take any questions that any of you have. Thank you so much. It's hot in here.
Thank you very much, Najla. Just a reminder to those watching online, this would be the time to chime in with any questions that you have, again, via Twitter, that's at Palestine Center, and on the Facebook and chat roll. So please send them in, and we'll ask Najla to respond. But let's start right here. Just wait for a moment for the microphone so that we can hear you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Yusuf. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Said Derakat. I'm a Palestinian journalist, but I also teach a course on Arab society, and I rely heavily on Orientalism and shattered myth and so on. So not a day goes by without learning a new idea in the book. My question to you is quite simple. You said something that Palestine is a place and an idea. Could you please explain that? Because for us that have daughters that were born and raised in this country, that is a perplexing thought.
Thank you. I think that it's interesting, and I'm glad you asked that question. Thank you. This is one of the most common things that has come up in my own journey. Another reason that I wanted to write this story was I wanted to talk about my father as a human being, because I think there's a lot of, despite what he said about identity being fluid and having many different identities, many people have conflated my father with Palestine and with a certain type of nationalism that I don't think was really what he was about, which isn't to say he wasn't proud to be Palestinian and proud to fight for equality. But I think that for my dad, and when he passed away, he had wanted to be buried in Lebanon. And certain people were upset about this. I don't know who these people are because I don't know them, but they were out there. Because he was Palestine to so many people in Lebanon, what it seems like, but my dad, like me, the only country I've ever really known in the Middle East is Lebanon. It's where my mom's family is from, and actually my dad's family, his mom has some roots in Lebanon as well. It's where my Palestinian family has lived, it's where my Lebanese family lived, and it's where we've been and where we felt was home. So part of the reason he wanted to be buried there was because it was quiet and no one was going to disturb his rest. But also it was in many ways our home in the Arab world. And I think that that is something that I really wanted to stress, because my father was born in Palestine in 1935, and he lived there until he was about 12, but he was also back and forth to Egypt. This is why some people say that my dad lied and says he's Palestinian, but he's really Egyptian. No, he's Palestinian, but he lived between Egypt and Jerusalem as a kid, and then he left. And he came to America, and he lived the rest of his life in America. He went back in 1992 for the first time. He may have been back one other time in the 60s, I'm not really sure. But it was not a place. And I am not one of the, I have a lot of Palestinian friends, American Palestinian friends, who go home to Palestine. They have family in Ramallah, or they have family in Israel proper, and their family are Israeli citizens in Haifa. I don't have that. I have no family there. My house is not mine, but I don't know if it's still the International Christian Embassy, but there is a sign on it that said that Martin Buber lived there, which is really nice because my dad also lived there. But anyway, so I have no real connection to the actual place, and in many ways my father did not either. So, and I'm not saying that to sort of start a fight, but I think that what Palestine represented to him and because my father was not really fond of nationalism and identities in any way. He liked being fluid. He liked being in exile. He liked being a million different things. if you asked him his identity, he would say, I have many different identities. He would say he was Palestinian, but he would also say all the other things. So for him and for me, Palestine, the idea of Palestine is just a simple struggle for justice and human rights. And that's it. It just like any other struggle, South Africa, this country, wherever, it's about equality and justice. And that's all you need. You don't need you don't need to be ashamed of that when you speak out on behalf of Palestinians. You don't have to be ashamed of where you're from or what you're saying, because it's very simple. And so I think that that's been a way for me to sort of explain, especially when people are like, oh, your dad was an anti-Semite and all these things. Like, no, my father believed in equality and justice. And I think that, especially for those of us who are American and feel maybe that we're mostly American and then have this other stuff behind us, Arab, Palestinian, Lebanese, Muslim, Christian, whatever it is, what has been carried through to us by our family is that we're people and we're entitled to the same rights as other people. And so that, to me, is why Palestine, despite it being not a place that I know very well or necessarily want to live, and my father used to say he didn't want to go back and live there, but he wanted people to be treated equally. And that's as simple as it is. And I think that that's what I learned from him, is that it's not that complicated. I mean, yes, he wrote very intense, fancy academic books that were very hard to read, but the essential point is that people are all the same. And so I feel like my goal in with my work is just trying to continue that message, because it's really not that complicated.
Trying to go around the room. Okay, we have right here. Just wait for the microphone for 1 second.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the talk. Very informative. My name is Oscar Ordenes. As a humanist in DC, I promote the intercultural arts and humanities. And I have two questions, very brief. One is, are you considering doing your play, your monologue, Palestine, here in the future? Sure. Thank you. And second, in that play, how do you tackle the idea of the fact that any struggle begins with the liberation of women?
Thank you. Here's the other thing that happened. I wrote this play, and I was like, I don't really know what I'm talking about. I'm going to write a play about Palestine, even though I don't really know what I'm talking about, even though I'm so insecure. And then I got an award from the feminist press for being like one of the top 40 feminists under 40. And I was like, wait, what? I'm a feminist? Because I didn't even realize that a lot of the way I'd seen the Middle East was through the eyes of a young woman. And I think that that's probably part of the reason that I wasn't interested, because I think that it seemed like men talked about politics and women weren't supposed, but thankfully I had an amazing mother and grandmothers and family members who were quite incredibly well educated and strong and had a lot of integrity and were just as vocal and outspoken about things as my father. But to answer your question about my play, I would love to do it. So if anyone has a theater or is a producer and wants to bring it to DC, I think this would be an excellent environment to do it in. I don't have any specific plans, but I would love to. And that how I dealt with the women issue is I didn't even deal with it. I just presented myself. I just stood on stage and told the story. And I think that a lot of it came out of that was this idea that, this experience about which I wrote was when I was in Gaza in this house where there were women in one room and men. That was the first and the only time I've ever experienced that in the Middle East. And I wanted to make that very clear, because the Arab women I grew up knowing and the women in the Middle East that I know in general are incredibly strong, intelligent, wonderful, powerful women. And so part of my own work is to dispel images that the Middle East is this place where women are oppressed or treated like second-class citizens. I mean, there are certain laws and things in place that in all of the Arab countries that are patriarchal and unfair and all of that. But, you know, my grandmother, my mother's mother, ran a school in Lebanon. It was the first national secular school in Lebanon. And she came to America in the 30s to get a PhD. She was very active in Palestinian human rights. She was an Arab nationalist. She was brilliant. And that's my grandmother on my mother's side. That's not even my dad's family. Wadad Makdisi Kortas. She asked me to say her name, so I'm saying it. And all of my aunts, cousin, everyone, all the women I know are part of this as much as anyone else. And so part of the reason I also wanted to write the book was because as an actress, there's a really limited idea of what an Arab woman is. And I talk about this a lot. And, you know, especially Hollywood, it's this idea that you get the job you're going to get in a movie is a girl wearing a scarf on her head. Who's either like the sister, the cousin, the wife, somebody of the terrorist guy. And it angers me so much because it's so one-dimensional. And that's really what initiated my interest in approaching this subject matter or my identity is that I mean, maybe this is how my parents raised me, but I think it's just a human reaction to this idea that I've been born and raised in New York City, and I'm, for all intents and purposes, American. And then I go to these auditions, and they're like, okay, you have this name, so you're going to be an Arab woman, and this is what an Arab woman is. And I will not stand for that. So I'm not entirely sure if I answered your question, but that's, to be fair, my status as a woman is probably what initiated most of this exploration of identity. And I'm just going to continue to talk and talk and talk and be annoying and just make clear that I come from a culture where women are far more powerful and interesting than others may know.
So, right here, and then we'll come over there. So.
My name is George Hishmi. I wonder whether you have suggestions or ideas how, as a parent or grandparent, will tell your offspring about Palestine. When do you start? How do you do it? Things like that. Since you had a gap in your upbringing.
Well, I think that it's very interesting. That's a great question. And what I've noticed when my family members who have read the book have said that they felt sad because they didn't realize what pain I was in. I mean, there's a lot more in the book than what I read, obviously, but they didn't realize what pain I was in over my identity. And a lot of what I went through was racial difficulties. I mean, I had, like, in the world I grew up at the time in New York, I was on, you know, as I said, on the east side with the blonde girls, and I had brown hair, and I lived on the side where the Jewish people lived. So I was like, basically had this idea in my head. It was all in my head. It wasn't. But what I saw in front of me was that I am different. But I wasn't really a minority because there was no sort of Arab American identity at the time. And then I would go home and my parents were like, "You're Arab, you're Arab." So to their credit, they were trying to make me proud. But I think in a lot of ways I got very confused. I tell the story in the book. Sorry, Mommy. About how when I started kindergarten in 1979, and then when I was in the first grade, the Iranian hostages were released, and we had, like, they wheeled the TV into the school, into our classroom. We got to see this thing on TV, and I went home and I was deliriously happy because the Americans were free. And my mom told me that I should be happy, of course, because that's great, but that the Algerians, who were Arabs, helped broker this agreement to free these people from the Iranians. So I got really mad at her. I was 6 years old, so that was a little bit complicated. I mean, now I think it's awesome, but it confused me a lot because I just wanted to fit in. And when you're 6, you know good guys, you know good guys and bad guys. So we were American and we weren't Iranian. And so part of the problem is that's how we set things up in this country. I'm sure I don't know. I've never been raised in another country. But you were either taught to be American or something else. And if you're not American, if you don't agree with America, I think it's different now. I think that, and someone quoted the other day, my father used to say, dissent is the greatest form of patriotism, meaning that, like, part of being an American, especially, like, considering what's going on now today in this very city, is voicing your discontent with, you know, standing for all things that America stands for, publicly and on a global scale. So I think that it's important to let kids know where they're from and to have them be proud of it. And I do very much commend the way that my parents constantly plied me with images of Arabs that were, or like introduced me to a culture that I was just part of, and that, you know, I came to love the Middle East because it was where my home was and where there was food and love and people. And I think that that's the best way. If you just show yourself as a human being who's, you know, their grandfather, their father, their mother, it's good to know where you're from. People want to know where they're from, especially in this country. And one of the things I remember in high school, somebody asked me where my dad was from, and this is the first time I'd ever said it. I said, he's from Palestine. And I said, and the guy said, wait, where's that? And I said, it's called Israel now. And he goes, they just changed it? It's not that hard, you know what I'm saying? So I was like, kind of, yeah, and they had to leave. That's all I said. And he was like, that's not fair. So I think that there are very simple ways to talk about it. And I don't discourage I think what my mom did is great because it obviously did help me. But, you know, it's important to talk to them about it, but let them let them lead and let them ask questions, because that's what I ultimately ended up doing, because I just didn't understand. And it's a different world now, you know, like when I grew up, it was very different. And, you know, I had to come of it, you know, like I said, I was born in 1974, and the Civil War was like, in Lebanon was basically from when I was about 1 year old until I was like 16. And then after that, as soon as that ended, during that, there was the Intifada, the first Intifada in Palestine. Then there was the first Gulf War. Then I went to college during the Oslo years, and I kind of took a break from being tortured by my culture. And no, I'm just kidding. And then I graduated, and then 9/11. And now post 9/11. So I've never had a break from having to confront these things. But I think what I learned to do in a very different way from my brother, who really set out to learn the language and learn the culture and live in it. And this is possibly because I was female. I just listened and asked questions. And I think my parents did a really good job of helping me along the way, until I was ready to start speaking for myself. And so I would say, you know, I would possibly be a little, I would say to a parent, and I don't know what I know about parenting, but just to be aware of, if you have a sensitive kid in any way, like I was a sensitive kid, I'm a sensitive grown-up, it's why I'm an artist, it's why I'm a writer, it's why I'm an actress, that if they seem to feel different or left out, that you might want to explore that with them, because it could have more. Because there's a lot of, and it's, as I said, it's a different world now. It's a much more multicultural world, but we do live in a society where people make comments all the time about Arabs, about Palestinians, about Muslims, without any regard for the fact that it's racism and it's hurting. So if a kid is sensitive and internalizes that, it's good to be aware of that, because I really, really did. I thought I was like a dirty, disgusting person, and apparently my family didn't know because I didn't say it out loud. So I think that that's important, because there's a racial element too. And I think that even though we live in this like very, as I said, multicultural world, I think that especially now there's a lot of polarization in our society and a lot of identity extremes, and it's very important to be aware of what your kids are internalizing and picking up, because I still sometimes watch movies and I'm like, the bad guy's an Arab guy, of course, but he's a bad guy. He should be I don't know. I still think in these terms because I was raised with it.
Well, I may follow. What I have done since I was born in Nazareth, I tell my American friends, privately or publicly, I'm the second Nazarene you know.
Yes.
I would say, who's the first?
Right.
This is Jesus. I says, yes, louder. Say it louder.
Right.
Yes, I come
Jesus.
from Nazareth.
My grandmother was from Nazareth, and I remember I once asked her if she knew Jesus when she was little, and she got very mad at me. She was old, so I thought, I don't know. But that's a great way in for a lot of young people, because I think that, and especially if you're Christian, you don't have to be Christian, but if you are Christian, people are always amazed. How did you get to be Christian? I'm from Nazareth. I don't understand, though. How did you get to be Christian? And so this is part of it as well, and also making those connections for people. I was talking with a young Egyptian woman yesterday, and we were saying how when I was in school, I learned about Egypt, ancient Egypt, and how amazing it was. But then I didn't know that Egypt now was like the same country. Because ancient Egypt was amazing, but modern Egypt was some Arab place. And it's, these are the things that we have to make connections, it's like we have to connect that it's the same place and it's got a long history, and we can be proud of ancient Egypt. We can also be proud of modern Egypt. Well, I don't know.
A question over here. And let's try to take a couple questions at a time so that we can address them as we're running out of time. So
Sorry.
We'll go here and here. We'll get you right after this. Your question, sir?
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. My name is Larry Shinakawa. I'm with the New World Research Institute. The question I have is this. In my case, I have a Japanese American and an Asian American and an Asian identity, as well as being an American. And they are multiple identities, but they overlap quite a lot. But I'm very significantly aware of race, just like you are.
Yes.
And what I wanted you to do is maybe perhaps comment about how you have these multiple identities and how they intersect with one another and how they're somewhat different, and yet they're empowering for you.
Sure.
We'll take the question over here as well.
Hi, my name is David Hilditch. Talking of polarization, I'm also wondering if there's any hope for reconciliation between Gaza and the West Bank.
That's a good question.
They just seem to be drifting further apart, and people talk about the two-state solution. The one-state solution is there a three-state solution. And secondly, very quickly, you also talked about women. Whatever happened to Hanan Hashrawi, who years ago was always on the news and seemed to be the relatively sane face of Palestinian nationalism? She seems to have disappeared. I know she's around a little bit. We just don't see her.
She's on TV sometimes. Okay. So, to address the first question, thank you. I talk about this a lot in the book, and I have a conversation with my father about this in the book, as when I was about 18 was when this whole political correct movement began, and people would say I'm African American or I'm whatever American, and everyone thought that my father was a huge fan of that because he was always talking about, being Palestinian and being Arab and all these things, and he was to a degree, but he said, you have to be careful because when you're separating yourself out, you're separating yourself out. And so he talks to me a bit about how in Canada, you're almost like, because America is based on this idea of assimilation, that the overriding thing comes that you have to find a way to be American, and you can be African American or Asian American or whatever it is, but you have to make sure that American is the one in capital letters somehow, and that's really just almost impossible for many of us. And so in the book, I struggle a lot with, I feel Arab and I feel American, but I don't feel, when I'm in Lebanon, I feel completely American. When I'm here, I feel completely Arab sometimes. And then, of course, when Gaza is being attacked, and I'm here, I feel more just isolated and sad and scared and alone than ever. But yet I still don't completely, I mean, sometimes I go to a protest. This has happened to me before in 2008 when the Gaza was being attacked, and I went to a protest, and then the other protesters were shouting Allahu Akbar, and I was like, well, I'm not Muslim, I can't, what does that have to do with Palestine? And then I felt like I didn't belong there. And so I don't identify with my religion, but I just felt like we constantly are doing these things where we're making people feel left out, when again what we're trying to do is assert that we're all the same. So I've just, I think, accepted that I'm not Arab or American or Arab American, or I don't know. I'm all of those things and none of them at the same time. Or I'll say I'm from New York, because that's my most clear identity that I have, and that's just means I'm weird anyway. So, and that's why I write about being, like the first line I say, I grew up as a Jew in New York City, because there are these cultural identifications that, like, if you live in this neighborhood and you act this way, you're this thing. So they're all completely arbitrary, and I think that's. But I don't think it's ever going to go away. But I think that I now realize it's what fueled my father's work, and in a way it fuels my work. I don't talk about it as eloquently. I don't talk about like exile and the poetry of not feeling rooted. I just talk about being confused and feeling uncomfortable. But it's the same thing, and what it does is it encourages you to constantly seek connections and alliances with other people. So to bridge into the other question, I think that, my father was one of the first people to speak of the one-state solution. And when people ask me about this, I'm like, I'm not a politician or a diplomat or anything. I don't know how these things happen. I know it takes a lot of time. But it is so clear, and I don't know why it has taken this long for people to understand this, that the only fair solution is to have a country where everyone has the same rights. It's pretty simple, once again. So in terms of what you're saying, when people say that to me in terms of Gaza and the West Bank, I mean, the first thing that has to happen is there has to not be a wall and a military occupation, and people in Gaza need to be able to leave and come and go. And, the very way it's set up now with the Palestinians cannot be a united group of people, because there's West Bank Palestinians, there's Palestinians who live within the state of Israel and have citizenship, there are Palestinians in Gaza, and then there are diaspora Palestinians. And among diaspora Palestinians, there's like my father who was born there and me who was born here. I don't know how we're going to get out of the actual physical political situation, but I do know that the only way is to start working toward taking down all of the walls and barriers and letting the country be an open country for all the people who live there. And I don't know what happened to Hanan Ashrawi. I've seen her on TV a bunch. I met her on that trip, but that was 20 years ago. So
we are just about out of time, but we'll just have one last question right up here in front, and then we'll invite you to join us to check out Najla's book and get some copies as well.
First of all, I'm so proud.
Thank you.
Your journey of discovery of your identity is so inspiring when you were talking and unraveling the problems that you were facing in order to define a clear sense of identity. Your mother told you you're an Arab American. Your father was Arab American. But why the emphasis on Palestine? Because Palestine encapsulates the indignity that a bargain has taken place,
yes,
where the conscience of the West has allowed a bargain to absolve the West from the crisis that it has done during the 30s and 40s, and therefore they have become permissive to Israel violating the human and national rights of the Palestinians. So you are a Palestinian Arab and an American Palestinian Arab identity. It's not a composition. Your Arab identity subsumes the Palestinian Arab, but the Palestinian has to be emphasized because it is the epitome of the humiliation that we want to recover from. Thank you.
Thank you, Nabil.
I also recommend, even though I'm here to promote my own book, Amin Maalouf has a book called, I don't know what it's called in French or Arabic, but it's called Identity, Violence and the Need to Belong, or something like that. And he says in it that, we tend to stick to and he's obviously Lebanese and has a lot of different conflicts of his own identity, but he speaks of this, that you're always going to defend the one that needs to be the most defended. So, my sister-in-law is half Irish and half Palestinian, and she always says she's Palestinian first, and it's not because she's not proud to be Irish, but she's like, well, we're okay. Ireland's okay right now, so I'm going to speak out about being Palestinian. And she's right, you do want to defend the one that is the most, that needs to be defended. And that's okay to hang on to that identity. There is a part of holding on to that identity because you're trying to insist that you exist and you're alive, and that's part of who you are, and you're not going to pretend it's not there because you owe it to your family and your ancestors and all the other people to say, this is part of who I am. In the same way that people in this country who are Native American like to say that they're Native American. It happens all the time. And it shouldn't be any different for Palestinians. Thank you.
Najla, thank you very much.